Aunt snatched my fiancé for her daughter. Now they're all crying after I took the trust fund and they realized my ex was a bum. So here's the thing. I'm 28, and I was engaged to this guy named Jake. He's 27. We'd been together for about 4 years, and last year we got engaged. It was supposed to be a small, intimate thing with close family and friends, but, well, it ended up being something a whole lot bigger than I ever expected, just not in a good way. To set the scene a bit, I've got this aunt, Carla, who's 52 and always in my business. Like, I never really cared for her much growing up. She's one of those people who compares everyone to her daughter, Megan. Megan's 24, and yeah, she's pretty, but seriously, there's not much else going on up there, if you get what I mean. Megan's like one of those people who you wonder how they even make it through a day without forgetting how to breathe. But whatever, I've always been the smart one in the family, and Megan's been the pretty one. Carla never missed a chance to remind me of that. So, Jake and I had been planning our wedding for this October. I was super excited because we were going to make it perfect, you know? Just before that, though, I got accepted to this summer program in the UK for work. Jake was totally cool with it, or at least I thought he was. Everything was fine when I left in June. We were talking every day, texting and all that. But after like 2 weeks, things just started to feel off. I'd text him and his replies would take longer and longer, and when we did talk, it was like he was distracted or just not interested. I asked him what was up, and he kept saying stuff like, "Oh, I'm just stressed about work," or "It's nothing, I'm fine." Typical guy, right? Always pretending like nothing's wrong when everything's clearly wrong. I figured maybe it was the distance or something, but we weren't new to long distance. We'd done it before without a problem, so I brushed it off. I was like, "We'll work it out when I get back." Well, turns out there wasn't anything to work out when I got back because Jake decided to take the coward's way out and just disappear. A week before my program was supposed to end, he ghosted me. Straight up, no more texts, no more calls, just radio silence. I remember thinking, there's no way this guy just bailed on me, right? Like, we're literally engaged. I felt so dumb for even wanting to fix things because it was like he didn't care anymore. Still, I tried to hold on to the idea that maybe something else was going on. Like maybe he was going through something, and he'd reach out eventually. But nope, nada. I didn't hear from him at all. Then, about a month later, after I'd been back home for a bit, there's a knock at my door. And who is it? Freaking Carla. She's got this smirk on her face that I should have known meant bad news. Now let me just say, Carla isn't the type to just drop by for a visit. If she's coming to your house, there's a reason, and it's usually not a good one. So I open the door and she hands me this fancy little envelope. "What's this?" I ask, already feeling like my stomach was doing flips. "It's a wedding invitation, sweetie," she says, all casual-like. Now, at this point, I'm thinking, oh cool, someone's getting married. But when I opened it and saw Jake's name next to Megan's, I literally felt like the ground was about to open up and swallow me whole. They were getting married. My fiancé was marrying my freaking cousin. I must have stood there for a solid minute, just staring at the invitation, not even blinking. Carla, being the absolute piece of work that she is, just stood there watching me. I swear she was enjoying every second of my confusion. When I finally looked up, I couldn't even form words. Like, how do you even respond to something like that? Before I could say anything, Carla goes, "I know this must be hard for you, but sweetie, what can we do? People fall in and out of love all the time." She actually said that, like it was no big deal that my fiancé had dumped me while I was away to marry her daughter. Her reasoning? Oh, Jake and Megan just connected, you know? After work, he'd take her for coffee, and well, you can't fight love, right? At this point, I'm just staring at her, my head spinning. The woman is practically gloating, and I'm over here about to throw up. And then she hits me with, "Don't blame Megan, though. You know how beautiful she is. I'm sure Jake just couldn't resist." I wanted to punch her. I really did. But instead, I just kind of stood there, tears in my eyes, trying to process what she was telling me. My aunt, the one who always treated me like crap compared to her perfect daughter, was now telling me that Jake had fallen for Megan because she was prettier. And the worst part? She was saying it like it was my fault for not being as pretty as Megan. I somehow managed to pull myself together enough to tell her I had something to do and she needed to leave. As she walked out, she threw in one last comment. "Don't take it too hard, sweetie. You're still young. I'm sure you'll find someone, eventually. Just, lower your standards a bit." Yeah, she actually said that. When she finally left, I slammed the door so hard I thought it might break off the hinges. I didn't know whether to scream, cry, or just sit there in silence. I ended up doing a mix of all three. I couldn't believe the nerve of her. And I couldn't believe that Jake, would do something like this. The guy who I was going to marry, who I thought loved me, had been seeing my cousin behind my back, and now they were getting married. It was like a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Over the next few days, the whole thing just kind of settled in. I kept replaying all these little moments in my head, wondering if there were signs I missed, if I could have done something differently. But honestly, looking back, Jake was just a coward. Instead of telling me straight up that he didn't want to be with me, he ghosted me and ran off with my cousin. The worst part? Everyone knew. My whole family knew, and no one told me. They all just played along with Carla's little game, pretending like nothing was happening while they planned a wedding behind my back. It was humiliating. I felt like the biggest fool in the world. But I wasn't going to stay down forever. Nope, I had plans, big plans. And if Jake thought he was going to walk away from this without facing any consequences, he had another thing coming. So after my Aunt Carla dropped that little wedding bombshell on me, I was left standing there, totally wrecked. But you know what? I wasn't going to let them just walk away from this without feeling some consequences. Sure, I was hurt, but that pain started turning into something else pretty quick. Anger. And with anger comes motivation. I decided that I wasn't going to be the one sitting around feeling sorry for myself while they lived it up like nothing happened. Jake and I had shared a lot of stuff. One of the biggest things was a trust fund we'd started together. We weren't super rich or anything, but we both saved up for years with plans to use it to start our own business once we were married. It was mostly my idea, to be honest, because Jake never really had a head for finances. That should have been a red flag, right? But hindsight is 20/20ths. Anyway, I was the one managing the whole thing. I put in most of the money because Jake was saving up for his dream of being a writer. Spoiler, he sucked at writing. So, after Carla's lovely visit, I logged into the trust fund account, and there it was, all our savings just sitting there, waiting. Now, I could have done the nice thing and left Jake's share untouched, but after what he did? Nah, I wasn't feeling very charitable. I transferred every last penny into my own account. He'd contributed maybe 20%. But honestly, after everything I'd spent on him during our relationship, supporting his writing career, paying for his stuff when he wasn't working, I figured this was more than fair. I thought, let's see how you start your business now, buddy. He had no clue I even had access to everything. In his mind, that money was still sitting pretty, waiting for the day we'd use it together. The joke was on him. He was about to get a rude awakening, but I'd save that for later. A few weeks go by, and I'm hearing all kinds of gossip from family and friends. Apparently, Jake quit his job around the time we got engaged to focus on writing, but it wasn't really going anywhere. No surprise there. He wasn't exactly disciplined. Instead of putting in the hours and hustling, he'd spend his days with Megan, going to cafes, acting like he was some tortured artist. Carla was loving it, though. She thought Jake was going to make it big, and when he did, her daughter would be married to a successful writer. Delusional, right? But then reality started catching up to them. I found out through my mom, who, by the way, was just as disgusted by all of this as I was, that Jake hadn't had a steady client in months. He was barely scraping by, relying on Megan's part-time job as a receptionist to cover their expenses. I laughed so hard when I heard that. Here's Carla, who thought she was marrying her daughter off to this rich, successful guy, and now they were struggling to pay rent. At this point, I still hadn't heard from Jake, and I was perfectly fine with that. Let him live in his little fantasy world for as long as he could. But of course, you can't avoid reality forever. One day, I was at my mom's house, just catching up on things, and there's a knock at the door. You can probably guess who it was. Jake, standing there with this pathetic look on his face like a lost puppy. My mom looked at me like, "Do you want me to get rid of him?" But I shook my head. I was ready for this. Jake came in, all awkward, trying to make small talk like we were still on good terms or something. I just sat there, letting him squirm. Finally, he got to the point. I need to talk to you about the trust fund. I didn't say anything at first, just raised an eyebrow. He continued, I know things ended badly, but we had that money saved up, for the business. He was stumbling over his words, clearly nervous. I need my half of it. Now let me tell you, it took everything in me not to burst out laughing right then and there. I just calmly said, what money? Jake looked confused. The trust fund, the one we were saving up together. Oh, that, I said, pretending like I just remembered. Yeah, I liquidated it. His face turned white. You, what? I took all the money out, I said, keeping my tone as nonchalant as possible. It's gone. He went from shock to anger in about 2 seconds. How could you do that? That was our money. We were going to start a business with that. I shrugged. There is no we anymore, remember? You're married to Megan now. And technically, most of that money was mine anyway. I supported you for months when you weren't working, so I'd say it evens out. Jake looked like he was going to explode. That's not fair. I put in money too. Yeah, and I spent a lot of my own money keeping you afloat, I shot back. So unless you want to take this to court and try to explain how you used my debit card to cover your bills when you weren't working, I'd suggest you drop it. He looked at me, mouth open, completely speechless. I could see the gears turning in his head as he realized he had no leg to stand on. If he pushed this any further, he'd end up owing me more than he already did. Fine, he muttered, clearly defeated. I'll drop it. He got up to leave, but not before giving me one last pleading look. I'm in a bad spot, you know. I don't have a job, and Megan's barely making enough for both of us. I thought, I thought maybe we could talk. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. But then I remembered how he'd ghosted me, married my cousin behind my back, and expected me to just roll over and take it. So I just smiled and said, good luck with that. He left, and I felt this huge weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I actually felt like I was getting control of my life back. Update 1. So after Jake came by and realized he wasn't getting a dime from me, I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd slink off and try to get his life together. You know, face the consequences of his choices like an adult. But of course, that would have been too easy, right? Things were just about to get messier because apparently Jake wasn't the only one with his eyes on the trust fund. A few days after the Jake situation, I'm chilling at my mom's place again, thinking I could actually have some peace. Wrong. There's another knock at the door. This time it's Carla and Megan. Honestly, I should have expected this. Of course, if Jake had come begging for money and got nothing, Carla would show up next. She was always the type to think she could talk her way out of anything. And I guess she thought she'd just show up and charm her way into getting some of that money back for her precious daughter. I opened the door and Carla immediately goes into this fake smile mode. Hi, sweetie. We were just in the neighborhood and thought we'd stop by. Yeah, sure. Just happened to be in the neighborhood. Megan's standing behind her, looking like she's about to burst into tears, which, honestly, was probably all part of the plan to make me feel guilty. Not gonna lie, it was kind of satisfying seeing her like that after everything that happened. But I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of acting like I cared. Carla goes, "Can we come in for a quick chat?" Before I can even say anything, she's already walking into the living room like she owns the place. Megan trails behind, looking like a sad little puppy. I'm like, okay, what's this about? Because I'm not in the mood for any more of their BS. Carla, of course, launches straight into it. We heard you talk to Jake the other day, she starts, all casual like she's discussing the weather. And well, he mentioned the trust fund and how you liquidated it. I didn't say anything, just crossed my arms and stared at her. She's fidgeting a bit, but trying to keep her fake smile going. Look, I know things didn't end well between you and Jake, but Megan and Jake are struggling right now. It's not easy starting a marriage when money's tight, and I just thought, maybe you could give them his share. It's only fair. I almost laughed out loud at that. Fair? I asked. Fair like how Jake dumped me and married my cousin behind my back? That kind of fair? Carla waved her hand like I was talking about some minor inconvenience. Oh, sweetie, don't be so dramatic. People move on, things change. But this money, this is about starting their life together. They need it. And there it was. The real reason for her visit. It wasn't about me or any kind of closure. Carla was just here to beg for money as usual. I glanced at Megan, who was still trying to look sad, but I could tell she was just as desperate as Carla. I sighed, trying to keep calm. Look, Carla, I said, I'm not giving them any money. Jake doesn't deserve a thing from me, and frankly, neither does Megan. They made their bed, now they can lie in it. That's when Megan finally spoke up. Her voice was shaky, like she was about to cry for real this time. Please, it's not like we're asking for much. We're going to get evicted if we don't pay rent soon. I didn't know things would get this bad. I raised an eyebrow. So let me get this straight. You're telling me you had no idea that Jake wasn't making any money when you two got married? Megan hesitated for a second, then shook her head. He told me he was working on some writing projects. I thought it would pay off, but it hasn't. I thought things would be different. I rolled my eyes. Yeah, well, guess what? Things aren't different. Jake's a bum, and now you're stuck with him. That's your problem, not mine. Carla looked like she was getting desperate now. She stepped closer, dropping the fake friendly act. You know, you've always been so smart. I've always admired that about you. You're doing so well for yourself, and we're just asking for a little help. You don't need the money like they do. This woman. I swear I could feel my blood boiling at that point. Carla, I don't need you to compliment me to try and manipulate me. You've never given a damn about me until now when you want something. You've always treated me like I'm less than Megan because she's prettier or whatever, and now you want me to bail her out? Are you kidding me? She opened her mouth to protest, but I wasn't done. And besides, You knew exactly what was going on. You were all for Jake and Megan getting married. You thought you hit the jackpot because you thought Jake was going to be some big shot writer. Well, guess what? He's not. And that's not my problem. Carla was silent for a moment, probably realizing there was no getting through to me. Megan, on the other hand, finally broke down. She started crying, full on sobbing, and I'll admit, for a split second I felt bad. But only for a split second. Then I remembered everything she'd done, and that pity went right out the window. Please, Megan sobbed. We don't have anywhere else to go. I don't know what to do. I stared at her, feeling nothing but cold indifference. Figure it out. You made your choice. Now live with it. Carla tried one last time. At least give them enough to cover the rent for a couple of months. They just need time to get back on their feet. Nope, I said, shaking my head. I'm done with all of you. You wanted Jake for Megan, you got him. You deal with the consequences. At that point, I'd had enough. I walked over to the front door and opened it. You can see yourselves out. Carla looked furious, but she didn't say anything. She grabbed Megan by the arm and they both stormed out, Megan still sobbing. As they left, Carla threw one last parting shot over her shoulder. You'll regret this. I just shrugged. Maybe, but I doubt it. When they were gone, I stood there for a moment, just letting it all sink in. It felt good, like I'd finally closed the door on that chapter of my life. They were out of my life, and I wasn't about to let them back in. Later that night, I talked to my mom about everything that had happened. She laughed when I told her how Carla had tried to guilt me into giving them money. You did the right thing, she said. They don't deserve anything from you. And she was right. I didn't owe them a damn thing. Update 2. All right, so after Carla and Megan's failed attempt to guilt trip me into giving them money, I thought maybe, just maybe, I could finally get some peace. But nah, life wasn't done throwing more nonsense my way. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that people like Carla and Jake don't just disappear quietly. They always find a way to stir up more drama, even when they're in the wrong. A couple weeks go by, and I'm living my life, feeling pretty good about how I handled things. I hadn't heard anything from Jake, Carla, or Megan, which was perfect. Then, one afternoon, my mom calls me and says, "You're not going to believe this." Now, when your mom starts a conversation like that, you know something wild's about to go down. So she tells me that Carla and Megan have been kicked out of my grandparents' house. Yeah, you heard that right. Apparently, after Carla's little visit to me, she went crying to my grandparents, begging them for help. Megan was in full drama queen mode, acting like her life was falling apart, which, I mean, to be fair, it kinda was. But my grandparents weren't having it. They've been dealing with Carla's freeloading for years. She'd been living with them, mooching off their pension, and not doing much to contribute around the house. I guess the straw that broke the camel's back was when they found out that Jake and Megan hadn't been paying rent for months and were facing eviction. My grandparents were furious. They'd always believed Carla's story that Jake was this successful writer who would take care of Megan, and now they were seeing that the whole thing was a lie. They finally had enough and told Carla that if she couldn't figure out how to support herself, she and Megan had to go. So, Carla and Megan got booted out. No more free ride at the grandparents' house. They had to go find their own place, and guess what? They ended up in this tiny rundown apartment in some sketchy neighborhood. Talk about karma hitting hard. My mom was practically laughing as she told me the whole story, and honestly, I couldn't help but laugh too. I mean, this is what they deserved, right? After all the crap they pulled, it was kind of satisfying to see them finally face the consequences of their actions. But the best part? Jake had no idea this was happening. Apparently, Carla and Megan hadn't told him they'd been kicked out, and he was still under the impression that they were living comfortably at my grandparents' house. I'm not sure what their plan was, but clearly, they weren't being honest with each other. Anyway, a few days after my mom's call, I get an email from Jake. Now, this was surprising because after our last conversation, I thought he was done trying to reach out to me. But nope, there he was popping back up in my inbox. The email started off like the others, him apologizing for how things ended, saying he messed up, blah, blah, blah. Honestly, I didn't care about his apologies at this point, but then he started talking about how hard things were for him now. Jake mentioned that he was struggling to find work because apparently his writing career wasn't panning out. Big shocker there, right? He'd been trying to land new clients, but no one was interested in hiring him. He even said he was thinking about going back to his old job, which made me laugh because that was the same job he quit to pursue his passion. Funny how things come full circle. But here's the thing. Jake asked me for advice. Yes, you read that right. The guy who dumped me for my cousin was now asking me for career advice. I had to read the email twice to make sure I wasn't imagining it. He actually wanted my help figuring out what to do next because, according to him, I was always the one who knew how to handle things. I couldn't believe the nerve of this guy. I mean, after everything he did, he had the audacity to come to me for help. I didn't respond right away because, honestly, I didn't know how to. Part of me wanted to just ignore him, but another part of me thought maybe this was my chance to show him how much he screwed up. So, after thinking it over for a bit, I replied. I kept it short and to the point. I told him that it wasn't my job to fix his problems and that he needed to figure it out on his own. I also reminded him that I wasn't the one who threw away our relationship. He was. I said something like, "You made your choice, Jake, and now you have to live with it." I didn't bother to offer any advice because, frankly, he didn't deserve it. He didn't reply, and I figured that was the end of it. But nope, there was more. A week later, I get another email. This time, it's not from Jake. It's from Megan. She was freaking out because they were officially getting evicted and they had nowhere to go. She asked if I could please reconsider and give them some of Jake's share of the trust fund so they could get back on their feet. She said they'd been struggling ever since they got married and didn't know how they were going to make it without some financial help. Now, I could have been nice. I could have felt sorry for her and handed over some cash to help them out. But after everything they did? Nah, I wasn't feeling generous. So I replied with a simple, "Sorry to hear that, but this isn't my problem. Good luck." I hit send and didn't give it another thought. If they were hoping for a bailout from me, they were going to be disappointed. After that, I heard through the family grapevine that Carla and Megan were scrambling to find somewhere to live. They tried asking my grandparents to take them back, but my grandparents weren't having it. They'd put their foot down, and honestly, I was proud of them for it. It was about time Carla faced some consequences for her freeloading ways. As for Jake, I heard he finally gave up on his writing dreams and went crawling back to his old job. He's probably miserable, but honestly, I don't care. He made his choices and now he's living with them. Me? I'm doing just fine. I moved on, got a new job, and even started dating again. Life's good, and I don't have to deal with their drama anymore. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that sometimes karma takes its sweet time, but it always shows up in the end. Update 3. So, after everything that went down with Jake, Carla, and Megan, I figured things would finally settle down. But, of course, that's not how life works when you've got people like them in your orbit. I thought they'd finally get the message, right? Like, stop bothering me, deal with your own problems, and let me live my life. But nope. There was still one last bit of drama waiting to unfold, and honestly, this one took me by surprise. A few months after all the eviction drama, I was pretty much back to normal. I'd gotten back into my work, started hanging out with my friends more, and I was dating again, which felt like a nice change of pace. It felt like I was finally moving on from all the nonsense. But then, out of nowhere, I get a call from my uncle, Carla's brother. Now, my uncle and I had always been cool. He wasn't really involved in the whole Carla and Megan situation, but he knew about it. He's one of those guys who stays out of family drama, but he'll call you if something major is going down. So, when I saw his name pop up on my phone, I knew something was up. I answered, and he immediately goes, "You're not going to believe what Carla did." Here we go again. Apparently, Carla had been spreading all kinds of lies about me to the rest of the family. She'd been telling people that I was the reason Jake and Megan were struggling. According to her, I'd stolen Jake's share of the trust fund. And that's why they couldn't pay rent or make ends meet. She was going around saying that I was this greedy, selfish person who didn't care about family, and that I was ruining Megan's future. Can you believe the nerve? I was furious. Like, I'd put up with a lot of crap from Carla over the years, but this was too much. I wasn't going to let her drag my name through the mud because she didn't want to admit that her daughter married a bum. My uncle told me that most of the family didn't believe her, but some people were starting to wonder if there was any truth to her story. That's when I knew I had to put an end to this once and for all. So, I decided to confront her. I wasn't going to let her keep spreading lies about me behind my back. If she wanted to play the victim, fine, but she wasn't going to do it at my expense. I called her up and told her we needed to talk, face to face. She tried to act all innocent on the phone like she didn't know what I was talking about, but I wasn't falling for it. I told her to meet me at a coffee shop the next day, and to my surprise, she actually agreed. When I got there, Carla was already sitting at a table looking all smug like she'd won some kind of battle. But I wasn't there to play games. I sat down and got straight to the point. "Why are you telling people I stole Jake's money?" I asked, keeping my voice calm but firm. She blinked at me, pretending to be confused. "I don't know what you're talking about, dear. I haven't said anything like that." "Yeah, right." "Cut the crap, Carla," I said. "I know you've been telling people that I took Jake's share of the trust fund. I know you've been blaming me for all the problems Jake and Megan are having, and I'm not going to let you keep spreading those lies. She sighed dramatically, like she was the one being wronged. I'm just trying to look out for my daughter. She's been through so much, and you know that money could have helped them. I stared at her, not believing what I was hearing. Your daughter? The one who married my fiancé behind my back? The one who lied to everyone about Jake being some successful writer? Yeah, she's really been through a lot, hasn't she? Carla's face hardened. You don't understand, do you? Megan is family. You should have helped her. At that point, I couldn't help but laugh. It was just so ridiculous. Help her? After everything you and Megan did to me? You seriously think I owe you anything? Carla leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper, like she was trying to intimidate me or something. You think you're better than us, don't you? Just because you've got your life together, you think you can look down on us. But I'm telling you right now, you're going to regret this. I rolled my eyes. I don't regret anything, Carla. You've spent years treating me like garbage, and now you're mad because I finally stood up for myself. You think you can just take whatever you want and walk all over people, but that's not how the world works. She didn't say anything for a moment, just sat there, glaring at me. I could see that she was starting to realize she wasn't going to win this one. Finally, she muttered, You'll regret it when you're all alone. That's when I knew this conversation was over. I stood up and grabbed my bag. You know what, Carla? I'd rather be alone than surrounded by people like you. I walked out of the coffee shop feeling lighter than I had in months. It was like I'd finally closed the door on all the toxic crap she and Megan had been putting me through. And honestly, it felt good. Later that day, I called my uncle and told him what happened. He laughed and said, Carla's always been like that. She's never going to change. He was probably right, but at least I didn't have to deal with her anymore. As for Megan and Jake, I heard through the grapevine that they were still struggling to get by. They'd moved into an even smaller apartment, and Jake was working a dead-end job he hated. Every once in a while, I'd hear from family members that Megan was complaining about how hard things were, but I didn't really care. They made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. Me? I was doing great. I'd moved on from the whole mess, focused on my career, and started seeing someone new. Life was good, and I wasn't going to let people like Carla or Megan bring me down anymore. If they wanted to keep playing the victim, that was their problem, not mine. And that's how it all ended. No dramatic resolution, no big apology from Carla or Megan. Just me moving on with my life, and them still stuck in the mess they created. Sometimes, that's the best kind of ending you can hope for.
You're working late again? Greg called from the kitchen, his tone dripping with fake concern. I glanced up from my laptop, masking the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. Big deadlines this week, I said casually. He smirked, pouring himself a glass of wine. You've got to take it easy, Holly. Life isn't just about work, you know. If only he knew. My name is Holly, and for the last 6 months I've been living a double life. Not the glamorous, exciting kind. No, my double life consisted of pretending everything was fine while quietly piecing together evidence of my husband's betrayal. It started with small things. Late-night meetings that didn't make sense, charges on our credit card for expensive restaurants I hadn't visited, and a faint whiff of unfamiliar perfume on his clothes. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, but one day, while organizing the mail, I found a receipt for a down payment on a car. A luxury car. That wasn't for me. I confronted him lightly at first, asking about the unusual expenses. Greg, ever the smooth talker, waved it off. Work perks, he'd said with a grin. You know how my clients like to celebrate. I wanted to believe him, but something about the way he avoided my eyes told me the truth was far less innocent. So, I started paying attention. It didn't take long to uncover the full picture. Greg wasn't just cheating. He was using our shared savings to fund a lifestyle for Melanie, his so-called client. Expensive dinners, shopping sprees, and the pièce de résistance, the car he planned to present to her as an anniversary gift. The audacity of it all was breathtaking. Here I was, working late nights to secure our future, while he drained our accounts to impress a woman who probably couldn't spell commitment if her life depended on it. But instead of confronting him, I stayed quiet. That night, as Greg settled onto the couch, I opened my laptop and began to plan. I researched fraud reporting procedures, legal options, and even looked up repossession companies. Every keystroke was fueled by a determination I hadn't felt in years. Greg thought he was clever, but he didn't realize he'd underestimated me. If he wanted to play dirty, I was ready to clean house. For the next few weeks, I played my part perfectly. I laughed at Greg's jokes, asked about his business trips, and even pretended not to notice when he'd come home smelling like an overpriced cologne I didn't buy for him. But behind the scenes, I was building my case. The first step was filing a fraud report. The car was purchased with our joint funds, but the dealership papers only had Greg's name on them, a detail I used to my advantage. I contacted the dealership under the guise of needing more information about the transaction. By the time I hung up, I had everything I needed: dates, amounts, and proof that the purchase had been made without my consent. I followed that up with a call to the bank. "I believe my account has been compromised," I told the fraud department. "There's a transaction I didn't authorize, and it's a significant amount." They flagged the account and opened an investigation. Every step I took tightened the noose around Greg's scheme. Meanwhile, I kept an eye on him. Every time he smirked over his phone or whispered into it like a teenager sneaking a call, I took mental notes. I even managed to catch a glimpse of a text from Melanie. "Can't wait to see the surprise you promised." The surprise? The car, no doubt. The thought made my stomach turn, but it also fueled my resolve. Greg thought he was the master manipulator, but he'd forgotten one crucial thing. I knew how to wait. The anniversary plans came together almost too perfectly. Greg suggested a fancy dinner at one of the restaurants he loved to frequent with Melanie. "I want to treat you right," he'd said, flashing a grin that once made me swoon, but now only made my skin crawl. "Sounds wonderful," I replied, masking my contempt with a sweet smile. I knew what he was doing, using the dinner as a cover to present Melanie with the car afterward, but I wasn't about to let him get away with it. That night, after Greg left for another client meeting, I finalized the details with the fraud investigator. The car's purchase was flagged, and the repossession team was scheduled. Everything was set to unfold just as Greg thought he was winning. As I closed my laptop, I felt a strange sense of calm. For weeks, I'd been quietly carrying the weight of his betrayal, pretending not to notice the lies piling up around me. But now, the power had shifted. Greg had no idea his world was about to collapse. The night of our anniversary dinner arrived, and Greg was in his element. He strolled into the house wearing a sharp suit, holding a bouquet of roses and a bottle of champagne. "Happy anniversary, babe," he said with a grin, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "Happy anniversary," I replied, my voice steady, my smile practiced. If he noticed the stiffness in my demeanor, he didn't show it. He was too busy gloating. At the restaurant, Greg spared no expense. He ordered the finest wine, the most extravagant dishes, and even arranged for a pianist to play our song. It would have been romantic if I hadn't known the truth. As he sipped his wine, Greg's phone buzzed. His expression lit up when he read the message, though he quickly tried to mask it. "Everything okay?" I asked, feigning curiosity. "Just a work thing," he said, slipping the phone back into his pocket. "Nothing to worry about." I nodded, biting back a smile. I knew exactly what the message said. Melanie was waiting for her surprise. After dinner, Greg suggested we take a walk. "It's such a beautiful night," he said, slipping his arm around my shoulders. I played along, letting him lead me back to the car. He opened the passenger door for me like the perfect gentleman, but I could see the excitement in his eyes. He was counting the minutes until he could ditch me and deliver his grand gesture to Melanie. Back at the house, I watched Greg check his watch repeatedly, his impatience barely concealed. "I've got to run out for a bit," he said finally, his tone casual. "Work emergency." "On our anniversary?" I asked, tilting my head innocently. "It won't take long," he assured me. "Just something I need to handle." I smiled sweetly. "Of course. Don't let me keep you." As he grabbed the keys and headed out the door, I sat back on the couch, my heart pounding. I could imagine the scene unfolding already. Greg pulling up to Melanie's place, handing her the keys and basking in her adoration, until the repossession team arrived. I didn't have to wait long. An hour later, my phone buzzed with a text from Detective Ruiz. Repossession complete. Everything went as planned. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling, a mix of relief and satisfaction washing over me. Greg had no idea yet, but his perfect little charade had just come crashing down. And this time, I wasn't the one left picking up the pieces. When Greg returned later that night, his face was flushed, and his usual swagger was noticeably absent. He slammed the front door harder than necessary, his keys clinking loudly as he tossed them on the counter. "Rough night?" I asked, glancing up from the book I was pretending to read. He shot me a look, but his words were measured. "Just some unexpected complications," he said, pulling at the knot of his tie. "Anything I can help with?" I asked, my voice dripping with feigned concern. "No," he snapped, then quickly softened his tone. "I mean, it's fine. Nothing for you to worry about." I bit back a smirk and returned to my book, letting the silence stretch between us. Watching Greg squirm was almost too satisfying, but I wasn't done yet. As he disappeared into the bedroom, muttering something about needing to figure things out, I received another text from Detective Ruiz. "Your husband filed a report with the dealership. Claimed the car was taken by mistake. We'll keep you updated." I chuckled softly, imagining Greg's humiliation as he tried to explain the repossession without revealing the fraud. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Greg pacing in the kitchen. He was on the phone, his voice low and tense. "I don't care what it takes," he was saying. "Just fix it. She's furious, and I can't—" He stopped abruptly when he noticed me standing in the doorway. "Morning," I said, pouring myself a cup of coffee. He forced a smile. "Morning. Just handling some work stuff." "Sounds stressful," I said, taking a sip of coffee. "Anything I should know about?" "No," he said quickly, his tone clipped. "Nothing you need to worry about." For the rest of the day, Greg was uncharacteristically quiet. He spent hours on his laptop, muttering under his breath and occasionally slamming the lid shut in frustration. I could tell he was trying to salvage the situation, but there was nothing he could do. The fraud report had triggered a full investigation, and the dealership wasn't about to hand the car back without answers. By the evening, Greg's patience had worn thin. "Do you ever feel like the universe is just out to get you?" he asked suddenly, his tone bitter. "Sometimes," I replied, keeping my expression neutral. "But I think the universe has a way of balancing things out, don't you?" He didn't respond, but the look he gave me lingered a little too long, as if he suspected I knew more than I let on. The cracks in Greg's composure grew more obvious by the day. He was short-tempered, distracted, and constantly on the phone, arguing with someone on the other end. I didn't press him. Instead, I watched and waited, silently enjoying the unraveling of his carefully constructed facade. One evening, I overheard a particularly heated call. Greg was pacing in the living room, his voice low but furious. "I told you I'd fix it," he hissed. "Just give me a little more time. It's not my fault. These things happen." I could guess who he was talking to. Melanie. I leaned against the kitchen counter, pretending to scroll through my phone, though every fiber of my being was focused on his words. "She's overreacting," Greg muttered, clearly trying to calm whoever was on the other end. "You don't need to make this a big deal. I'll sort it out." The call ended abruptly, and Greg threw his phone onto the couch, muttering a string of curses. "Everything okay?" I asked, stepping into the living room with feigned innocence. He looked up, startled, then forced a tight smile. "Yeah, just work stuff." "Must be tough," I said, sitting down across from him. "You've been so stressed lately. Are you sure there's nothing I can do to help?" His jaw tightened, but he shook his head. "No, I've got it under control." That night, I received another update from Detective Ruiz. "The investigation is moving forward. The dealership has corroborated the fraud report. Your husband's activity is under review. I stared at the message, a mix of relief and anticipation coursing through me. The net was closing in, and Greg had no idea. The next morning, Greg's mood hit a new low. He sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, barely touching his coffee. "I don't know what's wrong with people these days," he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Everyone's out for themselves." I almost choked on my coffee but managed to stifle a laugh. "Really? What happened?" He waved his hand dismissively. "Just some setbacks. Nothing for you to worry about." "Of course," I said sweetly, hiding my smirk behind the rim of my mug. By the end of the week, Greg was visibly unraveling. His confident demeanor was gone, replaced by a man grasping at straws. As he sat in the living room that evening, typing furiously on his laptop, I leaned against the doorway. "You know, Greg," I said casually, "sometimes people get exactly what they deserve." He froze for a moment, his fingers hovering over the keyboard before turning to look at me. "What's that supposed to mean?" I shrugged, my expression calm. "Just something to think about." The breaking point came on a Saturday evening. Greg had been on edge all day, snapping at everything and everyone. By the time he got a call from Melanie, his carefully maintained mask shattered entirely. I was in the kitchen when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, cursed under his breath, and walked outside to take the call. Curious, I followed quietly, staying just out of sight by the open window. "You don't understand," Greg hissed, his voice frantic. "It's not my fault. The dealership's claiming fraud, but I didn't—" He paused, clearly interrupted by a furious tirade on the other end. "I told you I'd fix it," he said, his voice cracking. "Do you think I like this any more than you do? Just give me a little more time, Melanie." Her voice was muffled, but her anger was unmistakable. When he finally hung up, Greg stormed back inside, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. "Everything okay?" I asked innocently, glancing up from my laptop as he stormed past. "Fine," he snapped, disappearing into the bedroom. Moments later, I heard the unmistakable sound of drawers being yanked open and slammed shut. Curious, I peeked into the room and found him frantically rummaging through his closet, throwing clothes and shoes onto the bed. "What are you doing?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Packing," he said shortly. "Packing?" I raised an eyebrow. "Are you going somewhere?" "Don't start, Holly," he said, his voice tight. "I don't have time for this right now." I crossed my arms, watching as he stuffed random items into a duffel bag. "What's going on, Greg? You've been acting strange all week." He froze for a moment, his back to me, before turning around. "It's nothing," he said, his tone sharper than usual. "Just a work emergency I need to deal with." I held his gaze, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably long. Finally, I smiled. "If you say so." As Greg left with his hastily packed bag, I received a text from Detective Ruiz. "The investigation is moving fast. Expect more developments soon." I sat on the couch, staring at the door Greg had just walked through, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and anticipation. He thought he was running to fix things, but the truth was, there was nothing left to fix. By the time he realized it, it would be too late. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to relax. The plan was in motion, and the pieces were falling into place. All I had to do now was wait. And if there was one thing I'd learned over the years, it was how to wait. Monday morning, I woke to a string of missed calls and frantic voicemails from Greg. "Holly, call me back, it's urgent." "Where are you? I need to talk to you now." "They're saying fraud, but it's not true. You've got to help me fix this." I deleted each one without hesitation, savoring the quiet triumph of knowing the tables had finally turned. Over coffee, I texted Detective Ruiz for an update. His reply was swift. "Greg tried to contact the dealership this morning. He's panicking, but the fraud investigation has progressed too far for him to undo anything." I smiled to myself, imagining Greg's face as he realized there was no way out. Around midday, the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Greg stood on the porch looking disheveled and desperate. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie askew, and his usual arrogance was nowhere to be found. "We need to talk," he said, his tone pleading. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Talk about what, Greg? The car you bought for your mistress, or the fraud charges you're facing?" His eyes widened, panic flickering across his face. "Holly, I can explain." "No need," I cut him off. "I know everything. The fake business trips, the luxury dinners, the car. You thought I wouldn't notice, but I've known for months." He stumbled over his words, trying to piece together a defense, but I didn't give him the chance. "You used our money to fund your lies," I said, my voice steady. "You betrayed me, and now you're paying the price." He stepped closer, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Holly, please. I messed up, but we can fix this. I'll pay you back. I'll do whatever it takes." I raised an eyebrow. "You'll pay me back? With what? Your empty promises or the love letters from Melanie?" The mention of her name made him flinch, and I knew I'd hit a nerve. Before he could respond, I stepped back and gestured to the stack of papers sitting on the entryway table. "You can start by signing these," I said. Greg hesitated, glancing at the documents. "What is this?" "Divorce papers," I replied. "You've already lost the car, and soon you'll lose access to everything else. Consider this your final chance to walk away with whatever dignity you have left." He stared at me, his jaw tightening. For a moment I thought he might argue, but then his shoulders sagged in defeat. "You don't have to do this," he said weakly. "Yes, I do," I said firmly. "Because unlike you, I know how to finish what I start." Greg left without another word, and as I closed the door behind him, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The man who had taken so much from me was finally out of my life, and for the first time in years, I felt free. The house felt eerily quiet after Greg left, but it wasn't the unsettling kind of silence I'd grown used to during our marriage. This was the peaceful kind, the kind that meant freedom. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the signed divorce papers. Greg had left reluctantly, his pleas still echoing in my mind, but the weight of his betrayal no longer sat heavy on my shoulders. For the first time in months, I felt in control. Over the next few days, I started putting my life back together piece by piece. The first step was meeting with my lawyer to finalize the divorce. Clara, ever efficient, was thrilled with how smoothly things were progressing. "With the fraud investigation and the financial evidence we've gathered, he doesn't have much leverage," Clara said, flipping through her notes. "You'll keep the house, your assets, and any remaining funds he hasn't squandered." "And what about the fraud case?" I asked, my voice steady but curious. "That's moving forward as well," Clara replied. "Detective Ruiz has ensured that all the pieces are in place. Greg will be facing charges soon, and given the evidence, it's unlikely he'll avoid jail time." I nodded, the news giving me a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. While the legal battles moved forward, I focused on reclaiming the space Greg had tried to overshadow. I rearranged the furniture, replaced the old curtains with ones I'd picked out, and even painted the living room a soft shade of blue, my favorite color, not his. Amanda came over one afternoon to help, armed with paint rollers and a bottle of wine. "This place already feels different," she said as we worked. "It's like you've taken back the energy he tried to drain from it." "That's the goal," I replied with a smile. "I want this house to feel like mine, not a reminder of him." I also started reconnecting with friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage. Greg had always insisted on controlling our social life, dictating who we spent time with and when. Now, I was free to make my own choices. One evening, I hosted a small dinner party with Amanda and a few close friends. As we laughed and shared stories over a meal I'd cooked myself, I realized how much I'd missed this, being surrounded by people who truly cared about me, not the version of me Greg had tried to shape. The investigation into Greg's fraud continued to make progress. Detective Ruiz called me with updates every few days, his tone always professional but tinged with satisfaction. "The dealership is cooperating fully," he said during one call. Greg's attempts to cover his tracks only made things worse for him. It's a matter of time before we see this through. I thanked him, feeling a mix of relief and validation. Greg had spent years trying to manipulate me, but in the end, he'd only outsmarted himself. As I hung up the phone, I stood in the middle of my freshly painted living room, taking it all in. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like home. The weeks after Greg's departure brought a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. The house, once filled with tension and lies, now felt like a sanctuary. One morning, as I sat on the back porch sipping coffee, I opened my notebook and started jotting down plans for the future. For so long, my life had revolved around keeping Greg happy, balancing his whims and smoothing over his mistakes. Now, for the first time, I could focus entirely on myself. At the top of the page, I wrote, "Things I've always wanted to do." The list grew quickly. Redecorate the house, travel to Greece, start my own business, spend more time with friends and family. Each item felt like a step toward reclaiming my identity, one that had been overshadowed by Greg's selfishness for too long. I started small, tackling the first item on the list. With Amanda's help, I transformed the house into a reflection of my style, warm, inviting, and unapologetically mine. We painted the walls in vibrant colors, replaced the furniture Greg had insisted on, and even turned his old home office into an art studio. "This feels like you," Amanda said as we hung a large painting on the living room wall. "It's like the house finally matches the person living in it." I smiled, feeling a surge of pride. It's a work in progress, but it's getting there. The next step was rebuilding my career. During my marriage, Greg had discouraged me from pursuing my professional goals, insisting that his ambitions were more important. Now, I was determined to make up for lost time. I reached out to old colleagues and mentors, explaining my situation and expressing my interest in re-entering the workforce. Their support was overwhelming, and within weeks, I had several promising opportunities lined up. One evening, I received a call from a former boss who offered me a consulting position on a project I was passionate about. "We'd love to have you back," she said warmly. "Thank you," I replied, feeling a sense of validation I hadn't realized I needed. "I'm ready." As I settled into my new routine, I began to notice subtle but significant changes in myself. I was more confident, more decisive, and more willing to take risks. The fear and self-doubt that Greg had instilled in me were fading, replaced by a quiet strength I hadn't known I possessed. One evening, as I sat on the couch with a glass of wine, I looked around the house and smiled. This was my life now, messy, imperfect, and entirely my own. A few weeks later, I received a call from Detective Ruiz. "The fraud investigation is officially complete," he said. "Greg has been formally charged and the case will proceed to court in a few months." The news hit me harder than I expected, not because I felt sorry for Greg, but because it symbolized the final unraveling of the life we'd once shared. "Thank you for everything," I told Ruiz, meaning it. Without his guidance, I wasn't sure I would have had the strength to see this through. "Justice takes time," he said simply, "but it's worth it." That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the back porch, staring up at the stars. The closure I'd been waiting for was finally within reach, and with it came a strange mix of emotions: relief, satisfaction, and a touch of sadness for the life I'd thought I'd have. Amanda came over the next day, her usual energy filling the house. "You look different," she said, handing me a bag of takeout. "Like a weight's been lifted." "Maybe it has," I replied with a small smile. "Greg's charges are moving forward, and the divorce is almost finalized. It feels like I can finally breathe again." Amanda grinned. "You're practically glowing. What's next?" I gestured to the notebook on the coffee table. "I've been making plans. Travel, work, maybe even a business of my own. I'm finally figuring out what I want, instead of what someone else expects of me." "About time," Amanda teased, raising her glass in a toast. "Here's to the next chapter." No. In the weeks that followed, I started checking more items off my list. I booked a solo trip to Greece, something I'd always dreamed of but never had the freedom to pursue. The thought of exploring ancient ruins and walking along sunlit beaches filled me with a sense of adventure I hadn't felt in years. At the same time, I dove into my consulting work with enthusiasm, reconnecting with the passion and drive that Greg had tried to stifle. Every step forward felt like a declaration. I was no longer defined by the mistakes of my past or the betrayal I'd endured. One afternoon, as I stood in my freshly redecorated living room, I glanced at the framed photo on the mantel. It was a picture of me and Amanda from years ago, taken long before Greg had entered my life. Looking at it now, I realized something important. I was still that person, the strong, capable woman who knew how to stand on her own 2 feet. Greg hadn't taken that from me, no matter how hard he'd tried. And now I was finally ready to move forward without looking back.
Cousin neglected his daughter for 16 years because of his wife. So on her 18th birthday, I stepped in, and they got mad. All right, so here's how this whole mess started. My wife, 27, and I, 30, live on a pretty big farm, and I mean big. We got 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and around 300 acres of land. We set it up with electrical hookups for campers, too. We thought, hey, why not make it a spot where the whole family can come and spend time together during summer or for holidays? We even built it like that on purpose. Figured it'd be nice to have one place where the family could come and crash for as long as they wanted. You know how some people have those places everyone gravitates towards for gatherings? That's what we wanted, and for a while, it worked out great. Summer would roll around and we'd have cousins, uncles, aunts, and everyone else filling up the place. There'd be kids running around, people sitting by the fire pit, and campers parked all around the field. It felt like the heart of the family. Now my cousin Bill, 56, is part of that crowd. He's been around forever, and he's always brought his kids when the family came to visit. He's got this daughter, Alice, who's 18 now. She's from his first marriage. Her mom was an immigrant, didn't have any family here, and unfortunately, she passed away when Alice was just 2. Really rough stuff. But the thing is, Bill remarried pretty quickly after that. 6 months later, he was with Tanya, who's 52 now. Together, they had 3 more kids. Bill and Tanya's place, though, it's like a whole different world. Everything is about their 2 oldest sons and their youngest daughter, the one they had together. Alice? It's like she's invisible over there. I mean, I'm not the smartest guy, but even I can see how much they leave her out. It's like she's just there. They do all this fun stuff with their kids, go on trips, sign them up for all sorts of activities, and she's just stuck at home. No vacations, no extracurriculars, nothing that costs a dime. She's pretty much left to fend for herself. And look, I've watched this kid grow up. She's been coming to our farm every summer for the past 4 years. I think it's because Bill and Tanya just want her out of their hair. They're always talking about how she's trouble and how she needs to learn some respect. I'm not saying she's perfect, but man, you can tell she's just trying to get some attention. But here's the thing. Alice is a handful. I won't sugarcoat it. She's got that teenage attitude, like I don't care about anything vibe. And yeah, she's loud. There have been plenty of times where she'd come over to our place, and I'd hear stories about her blowing up at her stepmom. Full-on screaming matches. And sometimes, it's over the smallest things. She slams doors, swears up a storm, and honestly, it's like she's always ready to go to battle. You might think, wow, this kid's a brat. And yeah, maybe she acts like one, but you gotta look at why she's like this. From what I've seen, the whole acting out thing only started when she realized she wasn't getting the same treatment as her siblings. She's like this totally different person when she's not at home. With other people, teachers, folks on our farm, even strangers, she's polite, quiet, and tries to blend in. But as soon as she gets home, it's like all hell breaks loose. I think about it a lot. It's like she's 2 different people. The Alice when she's out and about, and the Alice when she's around her dad and stepmom. It's no wonder she's upset. And what's wild is that they don't even see it. Bill and Tanya act like everything's fine with their kids, but when it comes to Alice, she's always the problem. They never stop to think, hey, maybe we're the ones causing this. Anyway, she started working on our farm summers ago because they needed her out of their space. And honestly, she's not bad at the work. Once she has something to focus on, she really puts in the effort. She's great with the animals, and she's even learned to do a few things like fixing fences and helping out with equipment. She seems to like it here, maybe because it's a break from all the drama at home. We didn't mind having her around. In fact, we liked that she was getting a taste of what it's like to work hard and actually be part of something. So this summer, things got a little more intense. She was turning 18, and I knew it was going to be a rough one. Bill had been going on about how he was kicking her out once she turned 18. It'll teach her responsibility, he said. But all I could think was, really, dude, you're kicking her out with no plan, no backup, nothing? Just like that, she's on her own? I'm not sure how that's supposed to teach anyone responsibility. We talked to Alice about it a few times, and you could tell she was nervous. She didn't have anywhere to go, and her dad was serious about kicking her out. We decided that if push came to shove, we'd take her in. My wife and I had the room, and we figured, why not give her a chance to get back on her feet? We could help her figure things out. Maybe get her set up for college or a job or something. She deserves that much, at least. The night before her birthday, we had her over for dinner. She didn't say much, just picked at her food and looked like she was a million miles away. My wife tried talking to her about her plans after she graduated, but Alice just shrugged. She didn't know. And how could she? Her parents didn't exactly set her up for success. Later that night, my wife and I had a long talk. We knew it might cause trouble if we took her in, but at the same time, we just couldn't leave her hanging. It's like, when you see someone drowning, you don't just stand there and watch. And that's what it felt like she was drowning, and we had a chance to throw her a life preserver. So we decided that the next morning, we'd show up at her place with my truck and get her stuff packed. Alice was surprised when we pulled up bright and early. She'd been bracing herself for her dad's boot, but I think she wasn't expecting anyone to actually show up for her. We loaded up her things, just the stuff she'd bought herself or what others had given her. I wasn't about to take anything that Bill and Tanya could say wasn't hers. The whole time, she was quiet, like she was afraid to believe it was actually happening. As we drove away, she finally spoke up. Thanks, she said, and it was the kind of thanks you don't hear often. It felt like relief, like someone finally lifted this huge weight off her shoulders. I didn't say much back, just told her that we were glad to have her. It felt like the right thing to do. We were giving her a shot to build her own life without all the baggage her parents kept dumping on her. I mean, it's not like we had all the answers or knew what we were doing. We just figured, if we could help someone out who needed it, why wouldn't we? And from that moment, everything started to change. But, of course, that's when things got complicated. All right, so after we got Alice settled in, things started to change pretty fast. At first, it was all good. She was quiet, probably just trying to adjust to being in a new place. We set her up in one of the guest rooms, plenty of space, her own bathroom, and some privacy. My wife and I wanted her to feel like it was her home, not just some temporary setup. We told her that she could stay as long as she needed, and there was no rush for her to figure everything out. Now, here's the thing. I don't have kids, so I'm not going to act like I know everything about raising one, especially not a teenager. But I knew enough to realize she was still carrying a lot of baggage from her dad and stepmom. It's not like you can just erase years of feeling left out and pushed aside just because you're in a new spot. So we took it slow. We didn't push her to talk about it or anything, but we made sure she knew she could if she wanted to. Alice mostly kept to herself the first few days. She'd come down for meals and help around the farm when we needed an extra hand, but other than that, she was pretty quiet. I figured she was still trying to wrap her head around everything. Can't blame her, really. One minute she's getting kicked out of her house, and the next, she's living with her cousin and his wife on a farm. That's a lot for anyone, let alone an 18-year-old who's been through what she has. My wife was great about it, though. She's always had a way of making people feel welcome. She'd leave snacks out for Alice, made sure her room was stocked with everything she might need, and even got her a small TV for her room. It was like her way of saying, hey, you belong here. And slowly but surely, Alice started to warm up. She began opening up a bit more, started helping out with the animals without us even asking, and she'd even join us at the dinner table with a smile now and then. Now, I'd love to say that everything was smooth sailing from there, but of course, that's when Bill and Tanya started getting wind of what was happening. It didn't take long. I mean, word travels fast in our family, especially when you've got a big place like ours where people are always coming and going. They must have heard from someone that Alice was staying with us, and, well, they didn't take it too well. The first time I heard from Bill was a couple of days after we moved Alice in. He called me up, and it was tense right from the start. No, hey, how are you? Or small talk, just straight to the point. What's this I hear about Alice staying with you? He asked. His voice had that tone, like he was already mad before I even said anything. I wasn't gonna lie. Yeah, she's here. You said she had to leave when she turned 18, and she didn't have anywhere else to go, so we figured we'd help her out. He let out this big sigh like he was annoyed. You know, that's not helping her. We were trying to teach her some responsibility. I'm not the kind of guy who gets into arguments over the phone, but that got me going. I tried to keep it calm, though. Bill, look, she's been through a lot. I'm not saying I know better than you, but kicking her out without a plan wasn't going to do her any good. She's a kid. She needs a place where she can get back on her feet. He wasn't having it. She's not your responsibility. She's mine. You think you're doing her a favor, but you're undermining what we're trying to teach her. I could feel my patience wearing thin. Well, Bill, if teaching her responsibility means leaving her out to dry, then yeah, I guess I am undermining that. But as long as she's here, she's safe and she's welcome. We went back and forth for a while, but it was like talking to a brick wall. He just kept repeating the same thing: how it was his job to parent her, how we were overstepping, and how we didn't understand what was best for Alice. Finally, I had enough and just told him, look, man, she's here and she's staying as long as she wants. If you've got a problem with that, I don't know what to tell you. He hung up after that, and I could tell things were about to get messy. Sure enough, the next day, I started getting calls and texts from other family members. Apparently, Bill and Tanya had been telling everyone that we took Alice away from them, and now they were refusing to come to any more family events unless she was gone. It felt like a slap in the face, to be honest. We'd always been the ones hosting everyone, making sure there was room for all, and now, because we took in Alice, suddenly we were the problem? My wife was livid. She's the kind of person who puts her heart into making people feel welcome, and to have people turning on us like that, it hurt. Aunt Linda was the next to call, and she tried to be more diplomatic about it. You know, it's not that they don't appreciate what you're doing for Alice. They just feel like you're stepping in where you shouldn't. Bill and Tanya have their ways of doing things, and they feel like you're going against them. I just told her straight. Aunt Linda, I'm not trying to start a fight here, but Alice needed a place to go, and we had room. I'm not going to turn her away because Bill and Tanya think it's a bad idea. We've got the space, and she's family. She sighed, and I could tell she was trying to find some middle ground. Maybe if Alice stayed somewhere else, like a dorm or an apartment, it might help. That way, Bill and Tanya wouldn't feel like you were taking sides. I didn't know what to say to that. It felt like everyone was more worried about keeping the peace with Bill and Tanya than actually thinking about what was best for Alice. And I get it. People don't like conflict, but sometimes you gotta stand your ground. I told Aunt Linda that Alice was welcome here as long as she wanted to stay, and that was the end of that conversation. After that, the texts and calls kept coming. A few cousins even said they wouldn't be bringing their kids over anymore. Something about how, with gas being so expensive, and if not everyone's coming, then it's not worth the trip. It all just sounded like excuses. They were picking sides, plain and simple. But we weren't backing down. My wife and I talked about it for hours one night, just trying to figure out how to handle it all. She was worried about the tension in the family, but she didn't regret helping Alice one bit. And neither did I. We both agreed that, at the end of the day, if we could give Alice a stable place where she felt like she belonged, then it was all worth it, even if some of the family didn't see it that way. Alice, on the other hand, started to notice the shift. She wasn't dumb. She knew her dad was making waves. One night she asked me, "Is it because of me that they're not coming around?" I didn't want to lie to her. "It's not your fault, Alice. Some people just don't get it, and that's on them, not you." She nodded, and for a second, I saw that same look she had when we picked her up, a mix of relief and uncertainty. I knew we were doing the right thing, but I also knew things were only going to get more complicated from here. All right, so after the family drama started, things got real awkward. We were still hosting our usual dinners and events, but instead of the usual crowd filling up the house and camping outside, the place felt half empty. Some of the family just stopped showing up altogether. The ones who did show up, well, it was obvious they felt caught in the middle. A lot of whispering, a lot of awkward glances at Alice, like they were trying to figure out if it was worth the trouble. Alice noticed too. She might not have said much about it, but you could tell. She'd pick at her food during dinner, stay quiet, and look like she was on edge. It's like she was waiting for someone to say something, maybe even to ask her to leave. But my wife and I made sure she knew that wasn't happening. One day, though, we had a gathering planned for my uncle's birthday. It's the kind of event that normally the whole family would show up for. We'd have tables set up outside, the fire pit going, kids running around. It was one of those big deals that everyone looked forward to. But this time, people started dropping out last minute. Cousin Lisa called and said her kids were sick, and they wouldn't be making it. Uncle Tom said something about work being too busy, and Aunt Linda said she wasn't feeling well. It was like everyone suddenly had an excuse. I knew better. They weren't skipping because they had to, they were skipping because of Alice. It pissed me off. I didn't want to say anything to Alice, but my wife saw it on my face. She just gave me that look that said, "Not in front of her." So I kept my mouth shut and tried to act like everything was fine. When the day came, only a handful of people showed up. We made the best of it, grilled some food, had a small fire going, but you could feel the tension. Everyone was walking on eggshells. At one point, Bill and Tanya showed up, and I knew right away it was going to be a problem. They hadn't been to the farm since Alice moved in, and I could tell from the way Tanya was eyeing her that it wasn't going to be a friendly visit. Bill tried to act all casual at first, talking with some of the family members who were there, but Tanya? She didn't waste any time. She walked right up to me while I was flipping burgers and started in. This isn't helping anyone, she said, her arms crossed and this tight look on her face. I knew exactly what she was talking about, but I pretended to play dumb. What do you mean? She huffed, like she was dealing with a child. Alice, you keeping her here. It's not doing her any favors, and it's causing all this drama in the family. I set down the spatula and looked her in the eye. Tanya, we're giving her a place to stay because she needs it, that's all. Well, Bill and I think it's time she moves on, she said, not even trying to hide her frustration. She's 18 now. She needs to learn how to stand on her own. I could feel the heat rising, and it wasn't from the grill. Stand on her own? You guys kicked her out with no backup plan. That's not teaching her independence. That's abandoning her. At this point, a few people nearby started to quiet down, clearly listening in. Alice was off helping my wife set up some stuff by the barn, but I could see a few family members exchanging looks, like they were gearing up for a front row seat to whatever was about to go down. Tanya leaned in, lowering her voice like she was giving me some kind of warning. Bill and I don't appreciate you getting in the middle of our family business. I wasn't about to back down. Well, maybe if you treated her like family in the first place, I wouldn't have to. That was it. She threw her hands up and walked away, muttering something about how stubborn I was and how we'd regret it. A few minutes later, Bill came up to me. He didn't look happy. We're not trying to be the bad guys here, he said, looking around like he was making sure no one else could hear. But Alice needs to move on. This isn't helping her grow. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. Bill, if you really believe that, then why didn't you help her before all this? Why'd you wait until she was 18 to throw her out? He shifted uncomfortably, like he didn't have a good answer for that. It's not that simple. I shook my head. I think it is. And until she's ready to move on, she's staying here. End of story. He didn't say anything else, just gave me this look like I was betraying him or something, and then he walked off. The rest of the night was just as tense. People tried to act like nothing happened, but it was obvious that the whole thing had put a damper on the mood. Bill and Tanya left early, and a few others followed soon after. After they left, my wife pulled me aside. You did the right thing, she said. Don't let them make you feel like you're in the wrong. I nodded, but it still felt like I was stuck in the middle of something I couldn't fix. And the worst part? Alice could tell something was off. After most of the guests had gone and we were cleaning up, she asked me, did they leave because of me? I hated that she felt like she was the cause of all this drama. It's not your fault, Alice. Some people just can't handle it when things don't go their way. She didn't say much after that, just went back to helping clean up. But I could tell she was thinking about it. The look on her face said it all, like she felt guilty for something that wasn't even her fault. The next few days were quiet. Alice kept busy around the farm, and we tried to keep things normal. But I knew this was far from over. We started getting more texts and calls, family members wanting to talk about the situation. It felt like everyone had an opinion on what we were doing. Some of them tried to be polite about it, saying things like, we just want to make sure Alice is okay. But I knew what they really meant. They wanted us to send her away so they could go back to pretending everything was fine. One night, after another round of calls, I sat down with my wife and Alice. I figured it was time we all talked about what was going on. Listen, Alice, I said, I know this is a lot, and I know it's not fair that people are making you feel like it's your fault. She looked down, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Maybe if I wasn't here, things would go back to normal. I shook my head. No, this isn't on you. They're the ones making it complicated. You don't have to worry about any of that. My wife jumped in too. We want you here, Alice. This is your home now, as long as you need it. Alice gave a small nod, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. I didn't blame her. After everything she'd been through, it made sense that she didn't trust easily. But we were determined to show her that she was safe with us. As the days went on, the calls kept coming, and I could tell that this was only the beginning of the family drama. But no matter how many times the phone rang or how many family members tried to push us, I knew one thing for sure. We weren't going to back down. Alice was staying, and we were going to stand by her, even if it meant going against half the family. So, after the awkward family dinner and all the messages from Bill, things started getting tense around the farm. Alice was still helping out, and she was trying to stay positive, but I could tell the whole situation was wearing on her. My wife and I were doing our best to keep things normal, but when your phone is constantly buzzing with family drama, it's hard to ignore it. Then, one day, we got an unexpected visit from one of my uncles, Uncle Tom. Now, Uncle Tom's always been the type to keep his head down and stay out of family business. He's never taken sides, never stirred up trouble, so when he showed up at the farm unannounced, I figured something big must be going on. I invited him in, and we sat down at the kitchen table while my wife made some coffee. Right off the bat, he had this look on his face, like he wasn't happy to be there. He shifted in his seat, like he was nervous, and I knew this conversation wasn't going to be a good one. I've been talking to Bill and Tanya, he started, rubbing the back of his neck. They're pretty upset about this whole situation with Alice. I sighed. Yeah, I've heard that before. What's the latest? He hesitated, then said, they're talking about getting the family involved. Like, everyone. They want to have a meeting, a family intervention, basically, to decide what should happen with Alice. I felt my jaw tighten. A family meeting? To decide what happens with Alice? She's not some community project, Tom. She's a person. I know, he said quickly. I told them that, but they're convinced that she needs to go back with them, and they think if enough of the family pressures you, you'll change your mind. It felt like a punch to the gut. It was one thing for Bill and Tanya to disagree with us privately, but dragging the entire family into it? That was a new low. So what? They want to have a vote on whether she gets to stay? Tom shrugged. Something like that. They think if enough people side with them, you'll feel like you have no choice. My wife, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. That's ridiculous. This isn't a democracy. Alice is staying because she needs to, and we're not kicking her out just because some people don't like it. Tom nodded, but he looked uncomfortable. Look, I'm just the messenger here. But they're serious about this. They're planning to have this meeting at Aunt Linda's house next week. It was all starting to click. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. They were trying to turn the whole family against us. I felt my hands ball into fists under the table. So, they think they can gang up on us, and that's going to make us back down? He held up his hands like he was trying to calm me down. I'm not saying it's right. I just wanted to give you a heads up so you know what's coming. My wife and I exchanged a look. We'd been trying to avoid more conflict, but it was clear that wasn't going to be an option anymore. They were making this a whole family issue, and we were going to have to decide whether we were going to stand our ground or let them push us around. After Uncle Tom left, we sat there for a while, trying to figure out what to do next. My wife suggested that we reach out to a few family members who'd been supportive, just to see if they'd back us up. It wasn't about taking sides, it was about making sure Alice knew she wasn't alone. So over the next few days, we started reaching out to people. We called Lisa, a cousin who'd been in our corner since the beginning. She was furious when she heard about the planned family meeting. That's ridiculous, she said. They're acting like Alice is some problem they need to fix. She's better off with you, and they know it. We also called a couple of uncles and aunts who had been on the fence before. Some of them were hesitant to take a stand, but a few agreed that what Bill and Tanya were doing was out of line. They promised to show up at Aunt Linda's house and speak up on Alice's behalf if things got ugly. Alice, meanwhile, was trying to act like everything was fine, but I could tell the idea of this family intervention was getting to her. One evening, while we were out feeding the animals, she finally brought it up. Is it true that they're having a meeting about me? She asked, her voice quiet. I nodded. Yeah, it's true, but we're not going to let them make you do anything you don't want to do. She looked down at her boots, kicking at the dirt. I just don't get why they're so determined to make me leave. They didn't want me when I was living there. I put a hand on her shoulder. It's not about you, Alice. It's about them wanting to control the situation. They don't like that we made a choice they don't agree with. She sighed. I don't want to cause more problems. You're not the problem, I said firmly. They are, and we're going to stand by you no matter what. The next week, the day of the so-called intervention came around. We knew we had to show up, even if we didn't want to. If we stayed away, they'd probably take that as us backing down. So we got in the truck and headed to Aunt Linda's. When we walked in, the tension was thick. Almost the entire family was there. Cousins, uncles, aunts, everyone. Bill and Tanya were sitting at the head of the table, looking like they were in charge of some big meeting. Alice stayed close to my wife, clearly uncomfortable. I could see the worried looks from a few of the relatives who'd promised to back us up. Bill stood up, acting all official. Thanks everyone for coming. We're here to discuss what's best for Alice. I rolled my eyes. What's best for Alice? Or what's best for you? Tanya jumped in. This isn't about us. It's about making sure Alice has a stable future. And we think that means coming back home. My wife crossed her arms. You mean back to the home she was kicked out of? Bill ignored that and started talking about how the family needed to unite and how this division was tearing everyone apart. It was all just a bunch of words to make themselves look like they were the victims. A few of our cousins spoke up, but it was clear Bill and Tanya had managed to get most of them on their side. Just as things were heating up, Lisa stood up. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice steady. Alice has a home. She's safe, she's loved, and she's doing well. If you really cared about her, you'd be supporting her, not trying to force her into a situation she doesn't want. A few others nodded, but most stayed quiet. I could tell it was going to be an uphill battle. Bill kept pushing, talking about how we were isolating Alice and making her dependent on us. It was all nonsense, but he was saying it with enough confidence that some people seemed to believe him. Finally, I'd had enough. I stood up and said, "This isn't a democracy. Alice is an adult and she's made her choice. We're not here to debate that. If you don't like it, that's your problem." There was a long silence. And then, one by one, people started leaving the room. Some gave us nods of support. Others just walked past without a word. Bill and Tanya stayed put, glaring at us. "We're not done with this," Bill said as we turned to leave. "Yeah, well, we are," I shot back. We left, and on the way home, Alice looked relieved for the first time in weeks. We knew it wasn't over, but at least she knew we had her back, no matter what the family decided. All right, so we were getting closer to the start of Alice's university classes, and things seemed like they were finally settling down a bit. She'd been working hard on the farm, getting things done, and it felt like she was finding her rhythm. My wife and I were trying to stay positive, figuring that once Alice started classes, maybe all this family drama would die down a bit. We thought that if she was in a good place and had a routine, maybe Bill and Tanya would back off. Then, just when we thought we could finally take a breath, my phone rang. It was Bill. I knew I shouldn't have answered, but a part of me hoped maybe, just maybe, he was calling to find some middle ground. Maybe he'd realized how much this whole thing was stressing Alice out, and he was ready to work things out. I should have known better. "Hey, man," I said, keeping my tone neutral. He didn't bother with a greeting. "I heard Alice is getting therapy," he said, his voice cold. "Yeah, she is," I replied, already feeling the tension creeping in. "She's been through a lot. She needs someone to talk to." "Well, I don't know why you think that's necessary," he snapped. "We raised her fine. She doesn't need therapy." I couldn't believe it. "Bill, she's been kicked out of her home. She's been dealing with a lot of stuff, and she needs support." "Support?" he scoffed. "Or are you just feeding into her behavior? Making her think she's a victim?" That was it for me. I tried to keep my cool, but it was hard. "Bill, I'm not feeding into anything. She's got a chance to get some help and move forward. If you can't see that, then maybe you're part of the problem." Silence. I could almost hear him grinding his teeth through the phone. "You've changed, you know that? You used to respect family. Now you're just creating division." That line hit hard. I'd always been about family. My wife and I built this whole place for family gatherings, for everyone to come together, and now he was acting like I was the one tearing things apart. It felt like a slap in the face, but I wasn't going to back down. "Bill, I'm doing what I think is right. You don't have to agree with it, but Alice is welcome here. We're not sending her away just because it makes things uncomfortable for you." He hung up, and I just sat there for a minute, trying to collect my thoughts. It felt like everything we'd done for Alice, everything we were trying to build, was being used against us. I was mad, but mostly I felt tired. Like no matter what we did, someone was always going to find a way to twist it into something negative. Later that night, I sat down with my wife to talk about it. We knew that once Alice started her classes, things were going to change. She'd have her own routine. And maybe, just maybe, the family would back off once they realized she was doing okay. My wife suggested we throw one more small gathering before Alice's classes kicked off, just to show her that we were proud of her and that she had a support system here. So, we planned a simple dinner, invited a few close family members, just the ones who had been supportive, and set it up to be more of a quiet celebration for Alice. We didn't want her to feel like she was on her own, even if some of the family didn't see it that way. The night of the dinner, everything was going smoothly. A few of my cousins showed up and a couple of aunts and uncles too. It was nice, and for a moment, it almost felt like old times. Alice seemed happy, laughing and talking with everyone. For once, it felt like we could actually have a normal night without any drama. But of course, that didn't last long. Just as we were finishing up dinner, I saw Bill's car pulling up the driveway. I knew right away this wasn't going to be a friendly visit. He hadn't been to the farm since the whole thing started, and him showing up now felt like a bad sign. He got out of the car, and Tanya was with him. They walked up to the house, and you could feel the tension in the air. A few of my cousins exchanged nervous looks, and Alice went quiet, her smile fading as soon as she saw them. My wife and I exchanged a look, and I knew we were thinking the same thing. This wasn't going to end well. Bill didn't waste any time. He walked right up to us, and with everyone watching, he said, "We need to talk. Now." I stayed calm, trying to keep things civil. "All right, let's step aside and talk privately." He shook his head. "No, we're doing this here in front of everyone." Tanya was standing right beside him, arms crossed, looking like she was ready for a fight. I glanced over at Alice, who was watching with this look of dread on her face. I could tell she was expecting the worst, and honestly, so was I. But I wasn't about to let Bill make a scene in front of everyone. "Fine," I said, crossing my arms. "What's this about?" Bill took a deep breath, like he was gearing up for a speech. "We've given this a lot of thought, and we think it's time for Alice to come home." The whole room went silent. I could see a few people looking around, confused. Alice looked shocked, and I could tell she didn't know what to say. I was just as surprised as she was. After all this time, now they wanted her back? Tanya nodded, stepping forward. "We think it's best if she comes back to live with us. We want to fix things as a family." Alice stayed quiet, staring down at her plate. My wife put a hand on her shoulder, giving her a reassuring squeeze. I didn't know what Bill and Tanya were playing at, but I wasn't about to let them bully Alice into going back. "She's staying here, Bill. We've been through this already." Bill's face hardened. "We don't want her here anymore. She belongs with us." Alice finally spoke up, her voice quiet but steady. "I don't want to go back." She looked up, meeting her dad's eyes for the first time. "You only want me back now because you don't want to look bad in front of the family." Tanya's face twisted in anger. "How dare you talk to us like that?" Alice didn't back down. "You kicked me out. You didn't care where I went or what happened to me. Now you show up here acting like everything's fine?" Bill's expression was hard to read, but I could tell he was losing patience. "We're your family, Alice. You can't just run away from that." My wife stood up, her voice calm but firm. "She's not running away from anything. She's trying to start fresh, and we're supporting her." Tanya rolled her eyes. "Oh, so now you two think you're her saviors, huh? This is why the family is divided, because you keep interfering." I'd had enough. "Interfering? You kicked her out. We gave her a place to stay because that's what family is supposed to do." Bill shook his head, looking around at everyone like he was trying to rally support. "This isn't how it's supposed to be. Alice belongs with us, and you need to stop undermining that." I felt my hands clenching into fists, but I tried to stay calm. "Alice is staying here, and that's final." Bill looked like he was about to argue, but then something seemed to shift. He just stared at me for a moment, then turned to Alice. "Fine, stay here, but don't expect us to keep trying. We're done." With that, he turned and walked away, Tanya following behind him. The silence in the room was heavy, and I could tell everyone was processing what just happened. Alice just sat there, staring at her plate, and I could see the tears starting to form in her eyes. My wife and I didn't push her to talk about it. We just sat with her, letting her know that no matter what, we were there for her. It wasn't the ending we'd hoped for, but at least now, she knew who really had her back. Parents kicked me out on my birthday, then tried to take over my new home, but I had the last word. So, my 18th birthday. It should have been a big deal, right? Like a milestone or whatever. I was expecting at least a small family dinner, maybe some cake. Just a chance to relax, you know? But nah, things went the opposite way, and it still feels unreal. I had zero clue what was about to happen when I woke up that morning. I remember walking into the kitchen, the smell of coffee hitting me like every other day. My dad was sitting at the table with this serious look on his face. But it wasn't the "you messed up" kind of serious, more like he was getting ready to deliver some big news. My mom was standing near the sink, her back to me, pretending to wash dishes, but I could tell she was just avoiding eye contact. I was like, "Hey, what's going on?" trying to read the room. And then my dad just says, "Steve, you're 18 now. Time to be on your own." That was it. Flat and cold, like he was telling me the weather. I just stood there, kind of shocked, waiting for him to laugh or something, like it was a joke. But no, he was dead serious. I asked, "Wait, what do you mean?" And he goes, "You're an adult. It's time for you to leave and figure things out." I looked over at my mom, hoping she'd say something, anything, but she just kept her back turned, scrubbing the same plate over and over. At that moment, it felt like the floor dropped out from under me. I mean, I get it, people move out at 18, but this was like a total surprise. No heads up, no discussion about plans or saving money, nothing. And it wasn't like we were struggling financially. They could easily afford to keep me there while I figured out my next steps. But nope, I was expected to pack up and get out right then and there. So I asked, "Where am I supposed to go?" And my dad just shrugs like it wasn't his problem anymore. "Figure it out, Steve. You're an adult." My head was spinning. It felt like one of those moments where everything's moving in slow motion and you're just stuck. Trying to process it all, I didn't even know where to start. I was like, wait, am I in trouble? Did I do something? And he just repeated, "It's time to grow up." It's funny because up until that point, I thought I had a pretty okay relationship with them. Sure, we had our arguments, but nothing that seemed like a get out and don't come back kind of thing. So I started asking, is this about me not going to college right away? I told you I needed time to figure things out. But my dad just waved me off, saying, "You've been freeloading for long enough. It's time to go." I felt my face get hot, that kind of anger that makes your hands shake, but there was nothing I could say to change his mind. I stood there for what felt like forever, hoping my mom would jump in. But she stayed silent, acting like I wasn't even there. That hurt more than anything my dad said. It was like she had already checked out of caring about me. Finally, I just gave up arguing. What was the point? I went to my room, grabbed the biggest duffel bag I could find, and started shoving my stuff in. Clothes, some books, my laptop, anything I thought I'd need. It was all happening so fast, and I felt this tightness in my chest, like I couldn't breathe. The walls of my room felt like they were closing in, like this place I'd called home for so long was suddenly suffocating me. I remember looking around my room, at all the posters and random stuff I'd collected over the years. It was like watching my childhood get packed away in minutes. The room felt empty and cold when I was done, and it hit me that this was it. I wasn't going to be coming back. When I came back out with my duffel bag, my dad didn't even look up from his coffee. My mom finally turned around, but she just looked past me, like I was some stranger passing through. I tried one last time. "Are you really just going to kick me out like this?" She finally spoke, but her voice was so cold. "It's for your own good, Steve." I didn't know what to say. It felt like everything was happening to someone else, like I was watching my life from the outside. I walked out of the house, my bag slung over my shoulder, feeling the weight of every step. I stood on the driveway for a minute, just staring at the house, hoping maybe they'd change their minds, but the door stayed closed. They didn't even bother to come out and say goodbye. As I walked down the street, I felt lost. I didn't have a plan, no idea where I was going to go. I started calling friends one by one, hoping someone would let me crash for the night. A couple of them were cool with it at first, but you could tell they were hesitating, like they didn't want to get too involved. I guess I can't blame them. Who wants a couch surfer showing up with no end date in sight? I ended up at my buddy Mark's place. He and his roommate were chill enough to let me crash for a few days. I remember lying on his couch that first night, staring up at the ceiling, feeling this weird mix of anger and confusion. Like, how did it go from a regular morning to being homeless in a matter of hours? It's crazy because I kept thinking it was some kind of mistake or test, like they were waiting for me to figure something out and come back. But the more time passed, the more I realized they were serious. They didn't want me there. It was like this punch in the gut, realizing your own family doesn't have your back. The first few nights weren't too bad. Mark and his roommate were cool, and we'd stay up late, playing video games and joking around. But after a while, I could tell they were getting tired of having me there. And honestly, I was starting to feel like a burden too. There's only so many times you can hear, "Hey man, any luck with finding a place?" before it starts to sting. So, after about a week, I packed up my stuff and moved on to another friend's place. After a few weeks of bouncing from couch to couch, it started becoming clear that I was running out of places to go. Friends that I thought would have my back started making excuses like, "Hey man, my roommate's getting annoyed," or "My girlfriend's coming over a lot and it's getting crowded." It wasn't like they were being jerks or anything, I get it. No one signs up for a long-term couch guest, and the longer I stayed, the more I could see it in their eyes. They were itching for me to move on, even if they didn't say it directly. But once the couches dried up, that's when things got real. I didn't have enough money for a motel, and sleeping in my car became the new normal. I tried to make the best of it. I set up my back seat like a cramped little bed, threw in some blankets and a pillow. It wasn't comfortable, but it was all I had. I parked in quiet spots, like behind gyms or in the corners of supermarket parking lots, hoping to avoid getting noticed. You never realize how loud parking lots are until you're trying to sleep in one. People coming and going, headlights flashing through the windows. Every noise had me on edge. The first few nights, I barely slept. My body would ache from being crammed in such a small space, and every noise outside made me jump. I'd wake up to security guards knocking on my window, telling me to move along. It's humiliating when you have to pack up and drive off, pretending like it's no big deal when really, you're just trying to find another spot to crash. I tried to make a routine out of it. I'd park at a 24-hour gym, using my membership to sneak in for showers and bathrooms. It felt like my only luxury, a hot shower. It kept me feeling human when everything else was slipping away. I kept a backpack with my essentials, a change of clothes, a toothbrush, and some snacks. It was weird having my life reduced to such a small amount of stuff. During the day, I'd spend hours in my car, applying for jobs on my phone wherever I could find free Wi-Fi. It felt like I was throwing resumes into a black hole. I'd get the occasional, "we'll keep your application on file," but nothing concrete. I started applying to places I never imagined working at: fast food chains, call centers, gas stations. At that point, I would have taken anything. One night, I thought maybe my family would have come around. It had been weeks, and I figured maybe they'd check in, see if I was okay. I decided to call my mom again. I didn't expect much, but I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd have a change of heart. When she picked up, her voice was flat, like I was a stranger. "Hey, Mom, it's me, just checking in." She didn't even ask how I was doing. It was just, "What do you need, Steve?" That stung. It was like every bit of hope I'd got sucked out in that moment, but I tried to keep it cool. "I was wondering if there's any chance I could stay with you guys for a bit, just till I get back on my feet." She didn't hesitate. "We already talked about this. We can't have you freeloading, Steve. You need to figure this out." The way she said it, so cold and detached, made my stomach drop. I felt like I was begging, and she was just shutting me down like I was some random guy asking for money on the street. I tried again, desperate. "I'm not asking for much, Mom. Just a couch. I'll pay rent once I start making money. I'm just stuck right now." There was a long pause, and for a second, I thought maybe she was considering it. But when she spoke again, it was just the same. "We all have our responsibilities. You're an adult now, and it's time to act like it." I hung up. I didn't even say goodbye. It was like a final slap in the face, knowing that my own mom didn't care if I was struggling. It felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I stared at my phone, watching the screen fade to black, realizing that I was completely and totally alone in this. After that call, something shifted. I stopped reaching out to people. It felt like every time I did, it just reminded me of how alone I really was. So I kept my head down and tried to survive the best way I could. I started parking in different places every night, trying not to stick out. The last thing I needed was for someone to recognize me and start asking questions. I didn't want anyone knowing how bad things had gotten. I was spending a lot of time in public libraries during the day, using their Wi-Fi and charging my phone. I'd sit at the same spot near the back, my duffel bag at my feet, pretending like I was just another person studying or reading. But inside, I felt this constant tension, like at any moment, someone was going to look at me and know I didn't belong. There's this weird thing about being homeless. Everything feels like a fight to keep your dignity. You don't want people to know you're struggling, but at the same time, you're doing everything you can just to get by. I remember this one night, parked behind a supermarket. It was late and I was trying to fall asleep when a cop knocked on my window. I jolted awake, heart pounding. I rolled down the window trying to act like everything was normal. "What are you doing here?" he asked, shining his flashlight inside. I tried to explain, but the look on his face said it all. He didn't care about my story. "You can't stay here, man. Move along." I nodded, trying not to sound bitter. "Yeah, sorry. I'll move." As I started my car and pulled out of the lot, I felt that familiar mix of anger and shame bubbling up again. It felt like no matter where I went, I was a problem. I drove around for an hour, aimlessly, trying to find another spot. I ended up in the parking lot of a 24-hour fast food place, and that became my new spot for the night. I watched people go through the drive-thru, laughing and talking, while I huddled in the back of my car trying to get some rest. It felt like there was this whole world moving on without me, and I was stuck on the outside, watching. Eventually, I learned how to blend in better. I'd park in different spots every night and get up early enough to move before anyone noticed. I became good at finding the quiet places, those hidden corners of lots where no one really cared. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was temporary, that any minute someone would come knocking again, telling me to move on. Every day was about finding the next spot, the next place to rest. It was this cycle of packing up, driving, unpacking, and repeating it all over again. I started feeling like I was in survival mode all the time, like I couldn't let my guard down, not even for a second. There were days when I'd sit in my car, staring at my phone, wondering if I should call anyone, my family, friends, even my brother. But I knew how those calls would go. I knew they'd either laugh or tell me to man up. So I just stopped trying. It felt like every time I reached out, I was proving them right, proving that I was the screw up they thought I was. But through all of it, I kept applying for jobs, kept trying to find a way out. I didn't want to stay stuck in that car forever. I was determined to find something, even if it was just a tiny chance to pull myself out of the mess I was in. But man, it was a lonely fight. Living out of my car wasn't easy, but after a while, I got into a rhythm. I figured out where to park, what time to move, and how to stay invisible. It was all about survival, just keeping my head down and pushing through. But man, even with all that, there were days where I felt like I was just going in circles. I spent a lot of my days at a 24-hour gym. I had this cheap membership that let me shower and keep myself somewhat clean. It was one of the only places where I didn't feel completely out of place. I'd go there, clean up, and then sit in my car, applying for any job I could find. It was like a full-time hustle, and it felt like for every 10 applications I sent out, maybe one would get a response. And those responses were usually the same. We appreciate your interest, but we've decided to move forward with other candidates. I was starting to feel like maybe this was it, that I'd just be stuck like this. But then, one day, I finally caught a break. A retail store called me for an interview. I remember getting that call and feeling this mix of hope and nerves. It wasn't a dream job by any means, but at that point, anything was better than nothing. I showed up to the interview wearing the best clothes I had, which was basically the cleanest shirt from my car and some jeans that were starting to fray at the ends. I walked in, trying to act like I had everything together, but inside, I was a mess. I was thinking, please, just give me a chance. The manager, this guy named Tony, seemed chill enough. We talked for a bit, and he asked the usual questions: availability, experience, stuff like that. I tried to stay confident, like I had it all figured out, but I could tell he saw through it a bit. Then he asked, do you have reliable transportation? I hesitated for a second, thinking about how I basically lived in my car, but I just nodded. Yeah, I've got a car. I left out the part where it was my makeshift home. Tony stared at me for a moment like he was sizing me up. Then he said, all right, you're hired. It's minimum wage and you'll start next week. Man, I can't even describe the relief I felt. It wasn't much, but it was something. It felt like I finally had a shot to get out of the mess I was in. That night, for the first time in a while, I actually felt hopeful. I parked my car in my usual spot, and instead of feeling defeated, I was thinking about how I was going to make this work. The first few weeks at the retail job were rough. It was long hours, mostly on my feet, dealing with customers and stocking shelves. But I didn't mind. I threw myself into it, working every shift they offered. I'd show up early, stay late, and basically just try to make myself useful. Tony noticed. He'd give me a nod every now and then, and sometimes he'd tell me, good job, Steve. It wasn't much, but it felt like someone actually saw the effort I was putting in. With the job came paychecks, and with paychecks came a bit of stability. I wasn't rolling in cash or anything, but I could finally afford to buy food without having to count every dollar. I started saving whatever I could, even if it was just a few bucks at a time. My car still doubled as my bed, but at least I didn't have to worry about starving. I'd make little meals from whatever I could get cheap at the store. Bread, canned stuff, nothing fancy, but it worked. After a couple of months, I was even able to scrape together enough to split a cheap condo with a guy named Mike. He was looking for a roommate, and honestly, I was just grateful for a place with 4 walls and a roof. We weren't best friends or anything, but he was chill enough. We agreed to split the rent and utilities right down the middle, and that was that. Moving into that condo felt like a victory. For the first time in months, I had a bed, a real one, and a kitchen to cook in. I remember the first night I stayed there, just lying on that bed, staring up at the ceiling, feeling like I'd finally caught a break. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it felt like I was finally clawing my way out of the hole I'd been stuck in for so long. But life has a way of knocking you down just when you start to feel steady. A few months in, the pandemic hit, and everything went sideways. The store I worked at shut down temporarily, and like dominoes, my little setup started falling apart. At first, I thought it'd be a short-term thing, like we'd close for a couple of weeks and then get back to normal. But it didn't take long before it was clear that wasn't going to happen. I got the call one afternoon. Tony was on the other end, and his voice was strained. Hey, Steve, I'm sorry, but we've got to let you go. We're not sure when we'll reopen. I tried to stay calm, but inside, I felt everything crumbling again. I thanked him for the opportunity, but the minute I hung up, I just sat there, staring at my phone, wondering what the hell I was going to do now. My roommate Mike was in the same boat. He lost his job too, and without either of us making money, the rent became impossible to keep up with. We stretched it as far as we could, pooling whatever savings we had, but eventually it wasn't enough. We had to break the lease, and just like that, I was back to square one. Packing my stuff into my car again felt like some cruel joke. It was like life was taunting me, saying, "Nice try, but not quite." I didn't have many options left, so I rigged up the back of my car with some old blankets, turning it into a camper setup. It wasn't great, but at least it was mine. I drove around looking for a spot where I could stay without getting hassled and found this old lot behind a strip mall. It was quiet enough, and no one seemed to care that I was there. I sat in my makeshift camper, looking out the window at the empty lot, and felt this wave of frustration. It felt like every step forward came with two steps back. But I tried to remind myself that I'd been here before, and I'd gotten through it. I knew how to hustle, how to survive. I just had to do it all over again. There were nights where I'd lay there staring at the ceiling of my car, feeling the weight of it all. It's hard to stay hopeful when everything feels temporary, like you're one step away from losing it all again. But at the same time, I knew I had no choice but to keep pushing forward. I'd done it once, and I'd have to do it again. The days started to blur together. I'd wake up early, head to the gym for a shower, and then spend hours looking for work online. I applied for everything: warehouses, grocery stores, delivery gigs, anything that would get me back on my feet. The stress was constant, but I kept telling myself, you just need one chance, one job to get things moving again. Some nights, I'd pull up to the same fast food place and park in the corner of the lot, watching the cars go through the drive-through, headlights cutting through the darkness. It felt like the world was still moving while I was stuck in place, waiting for something to give. But as rough as it was, I refused to let myself give up. I'd made it through before, and somehow, I was gonna do it again. Living in my car again felt like hitting the reset button, but this time with an even bigger challenge. I had been through this once already, so I knew the drill, but there was this constant weight on my shoulders. It's like, yeah, I knew what to do, but man, it felt 10 times harder to get back up when everything was closing down around me. Everywhere I looked, businesses were shutting their doors, and the job market was tighter than ever. I kept applying for anything I could find, but it was getting bleak. Weeks went by, and every day felt the same. Sending out resumes, checking my phone, and seeing nothing but rejections or worse, no replies at all. I started to wonder if I was ever going to catch a break again. I knew I couldn't stay stuck like this, but without an income, it felt like I was trapped in a loop. But then, one morning, I got a call. It was from this warehouse I'd applied to weeks ago. Honestly, I'd almost forgotten about it because I sent out so many applications. The guy on the phone sounded straightforward. "Steve, we've got an opening. It's long hours, but if you're available, you can start next Monday." I remember sitting there in my car, gripping the phone, trying not to sound too desperate as I agreed. I could barely believe it. Finally, a break. The warehouse was about 30 minutes away from where I'd been parking my car, and I was ready to do whatever it took to make it work. The day before my shift, I drove over there to check out the area, and I parked my car in a lot nearby, figuring I'd sleep there for the night. It wasn't the best spot, but I wanted to be close enough to make sure I got there on time. When I showed up for the first shift, I was nervous. It was one of those massive warehouses with rows and rows of boxes, pallets stacked high. I walked in, and it was loud, forklifts buzzing around, people shouting instructions. I felt a bit out of place at first, but I told myself to just focus on getting through the day. My boss, Mr. Thompson, was this older guy, gruff but fair. He gave me the rundown, showing me what needed to be done: moving boxes, sorting inventory, loading trucks. It was physically demanding, but that didn't bother me. I was just grateful to be working again. I pushed myself hard that first day, lifting everything I could, moving as fast as possible, just trying to show that I wasn't some lazy guy off the street. After my shift, I went up to Mr. Thompson, and I figured I'd ask a favor. "Hey, I know this is kind of a weird request, but is it okay if I park my car in the lot here, just until I get things figured out?" I expected him to say no, but he paused, studying me for a second. "You planning on sticking around, Steve?" he asked, and I nodded. "Absolutely. I'm here to work." He scratched his head for a moment, then nodded back. "All right, just make sure you're not in anyone's way, and you can hook up to the outlet over there if you need power." I felt this wave of relief. It might have been a small thing for him, but for me, it was huge. Being able to park without worrying about getting kicked out was like a weight lifting off my chest. That night, I pulled my car into a corner of the lot and plugged in, setting up my little camper space. Having lights and a bit of heat felt like a luxury. For the first time in a while, I didn't have to worry about someone banging on my window, telling me to move. I lay down in the back of my car, staring up at the roof, feeling a bit of hope creeping back in. It wasn't much, but it felt like a small step forward. The next few weeks were a grind. The warehouse job was tough. Long shifts, heavy lifting, and sometimes we'd be there until late at night. But I showed up early every day, making sure I was ready for anything they needed. Mr. Thompson noticed. He'd nod at me, sometimes giving me a thumbs up when I finished a task. It wasn't like we were buddies or anything, but I could tell he respected hard work. I started saving again. This time I was smarter about it. Every paycheck, I'd set aside as much as I could. I cut back on everything, eating the cheapest stuff I could find, skipping meals when I had to. It was all about building up a safety net so I wouldn't have to live in my car forever. I knew it wasn't going to be an overnight thing, but I kept my head down and focused. One day, after a long shift, Mr. Thompson pulled me aside. I thought maybe I'd messed something up, but instead he said, "You've been putting in the effort, Steve. We've got an opening for a night supervisor. You interested?" My heart was pounding. A supervisor role? That meant more money, more stability. I nodded so fast I probably looked desperate, but I didn't care. "Yes, absolutely," I said. The promotion was a game changer. It wasn't a huge raise, but it was enough that I could start thinking about the future. I started looking online for cheap apartments or even small manufactured homes. It felt good to have options again, to feel like I was moving forward instead of just surviving. As the weeks went by, I got better at the job. I learned how to manage shipments, oversee other workers, and make sure everything ran smoothly. It felt good to have responsibility, like I was proving to myself that I could handle more. And the best part? I was getting closer to my goal. Every dollar saved was one step closer to getting out of my car for good. I remember this one night, after a long shift. I was sitting in my car looking up places online, and I found this manufactured home that was within my budget. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had 3 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and it was in a quiet park, not too far from the warehouse. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. It felt like I was finally getting a glimpse of a life that wasn't just about scraping by. I saved the listing and told myself, just a few more months of grinding and this could be yours. It was the first time in ages that I felt like I was actually building something, not just surviving day to day. I lay back in my car that night, feeling this mix of exhaustion and excitement. It wasn't going to be easy, but I was finally seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. The days blurred into weeks, and I kept my routine. Early mornings, late nights, working as hard as I could. Mr. Thompson kept giving me more responsibilities, and with every shift, I felt a bit more secure. It was like, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just reacting to everything falling apart. I was actually in control, and it felt good. Of course, it wasn't perfect. Living out of my car was still rough. There were nights when the cold crept in, and no amount of blankets could keep me warm enough. But I held on to the thought of that manufactured home, of finally having a place that was mine, where I wouldn't have to worry about being kicked out or moving on. That hope was enough to keep me going. So that's where I was, working, saving, and slowly, bit by bit, building something for myself. It wasn't easy, but I knew I was on the right track. After months of grinding and saving, things were finally looking up. I had saved enough to seriously consider getting that manufactured home I'd been eyeing. I remember driving past it a few times just to get a feel for the neighborhood. It was a quiet spot, surrounded by trees and tucked away from the main road. Felt like the kind of place where I could actually breathe for once. It was far from fancy, but to me, it was perfect. One afternoon, I called the real estate agent listed on the sign. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number. I kept thinking about all the things that could go wrong. What if they ran a credit check and saw my terrible history? What if someone else already put an offer down? But I pushed those thoughts aside and waited as the phone rang. The agent was this cheerful guy named Pete. He asked a few basic questions, and I tried my best to sound confident, like I wasn't living out of my car and just barely making it. We set up a time for me to come check out the place. When I hung up, I felt this weird mix of nerves and excitement. This could be my shot at turning things around for good, but it also felt like everything was riding on it. The day of the viewing, I pulled up to the home early, parked my car around the corner, and tried to make myself look presentable. I had one decent button-up shirt left, and I hoped it would be enough. Pete was already there when I walked up, a big smile on his face. He shook my hand and started showing me around. Inside, it was simple: a small kitchen, a living room, and 3 bedrooms. The walls were plain, and the floors were a bit scuffed up, but it felt right. I could already picture myself fixing it up, making it mine. Pete talked about how it was a good starter home, how the previous owner had kept it in decent shape, and how it was a great opportunity for someone looking to build a future. I nodded along, trying not to let on how badly I wanted this to work. After the tour, he asked if I was interested in putting down an offer. I told him I was, and we sat down at the tiny kitchen table to go through the paperwork. My hands were still a bit shaky, but I tried to keep my voice steady as I filled everything out. We talked numbers, and when he mentioned the down payment, I felt a bit of relief. I had saved enough, but just barely. The next few days were tense. Pete said it would take some time for the paperwork to go through, and he'd have to check everything out on his end. I spent those days at work, trying to focus, but my mind was always drifting back to that house. I kept thinking, this could be it. This could finally be my home. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would race, hoping it was Pete with good news. One afternoon, while I was on my break at the warehouse, I finally got the call. Pete's voice was bright, and he said, "Steve, congratulations. The place is yours." I just stood there, holding my phone, not really believing it. I thanked him a bunch of times, and when I hung up, I felt this wave of relief wash over me. I did it. I actually did it. I drove over to the house later that day and just stood outside looking at it. It wasn't much, but it was mine. All the nights spent in my car, all the rough patches, felt like they had finally led to something. I had a place where I didn't have to worry about getting kicked out or moving every night. It was a real home. Moving in was another challenge, but this time it was the kind of challenge I wanted. I had to clean up the place, get some basic furniture, and make it livable. I started with the essentials: a mattress, a small table, and a couple of chairs. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough to get started. I spent my first night in the house sleeping on that mattress, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally relax. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into fixing the place up. I patched up the scuffed floors, painted the walls, and slowly started filling the space with things I'd collected over the years. It felt like every little improvement I made was a step toward reclaiming my life. It was my way of proving to myself that I wasn't just scraping by anymore. I was building something real. But of course, life has a way of dragging you back, no matter how far you think you've come. A few weeks after moving in, I made a mistake. I posted about the new place on social media. I guess I was feeling proud and wanted to share it, even if I hadn't talked to most of my family in ages. I posted a picture of me holding the keys in front of the door, captioned it with something like, "From living in my car to owning my first home, never give up." The response was huge. Friends, old coworkers, even some people I hadn't spoken to in years were leaving comments and congratulating me. It felt good to have that support. But then, of course, the past had to show up. One afternoon, I was unpacking a box of kitchen supplies when there was a knock on my door. I thought it might be a neighbor stopping by to say hello, but when I opened it, I was met with a familiar face. Dan, my older brother, standing there with his wife and kids. "Hey, Steve, saw your post. Nice place you got here," he said, stepping inside like he owned the place. His wife and kids followed, looking around like they were scoping the place out. I was caught off guard. "Dan, what are you doing here?" I asked, my voice tight. Dan gave me this casual shrug like it was no big deal. "Well, since you've got all this space now and it's just you, we were thinking maybe we could move in. You wouldn't even notice us." I stood there, my hands tightening into fists. I was furious. "No, Dan, this is my home." That's when he pulled out some papers and waved them in front of me. "Look, we even drew up rental agreements. You can stay in your camper. It's what you're used to, right?" I felt my blood boil. The audacity. I snatched the papers and scanned them. They were fake. My signature wasn't even close. I looked him in the eye, my voice steady. "Get out of my house, Dan. Now." He didn't move, his expression shifting to something darker. "Come on, Steve, don't make this difficult. We're family." That's when I knew they weren't leaving on their own. I pulled out my phone and dialed the police. As I stood there, waiting for them to arrive, I felt this overwhelming sense of betrayal. My own brother, trying to take over my life again. When the cops showed up, they took one look at the papers and saw right through it. They told Dan and his family they had to leave, and they did, but not before giving me this look like I was the one in the wrong. As they drove off, I felt this mix of anger and relief. The house was mine, and no one was going to take that from me. That night, as I locked up the house, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I had finally taken back control of my life, and this time, I wasn't letting anyone drag me down.